Good morning, Godfrey First United Methodist Church. Thank you for joining me for a new format for Coffee, Christ, and Conversation. You also might notice that I'm recording at a different time of day, which is why even though I've got my light on, I look a little bit like I'm in the witness protection program. This morning, we're going to be doing a new format, and what that is that this is pre-recorded. It's no longer live. So with now the understanding for Coffee, Christ, and Conversation will be that we can have coffee together, whenever you join me in this, that we'll definitely be talking about Christ and what Christ would like us to do in our own lives, but hopefully the conversation will be encouraged through the questions that I leave at the end so that we can move forward finding ways to have conversation even though we may not be live. If you don't like this format, if you want to go back to being live, let me know in the comments down below. But with all of that said, let us now go ahead and introduce the new book that we will also be studying during this new phase of Coffee, Christ, and Conversation. It's the book entitled Celebration of Discipline, The Path to Spiritual Growth by Richard J. Foster. It's an incredible book that teaches us what spiritual discipline might look like, and for that, we're going to see that it's outlined in the following way. There's the first part of the book, which is spiritual discipline as a door to liberation, and that serves as the introduction for this piece. That's what we'll be talking about today in today's Coffee, Christ, and Conversation. But to give you an outline of the rest of the book, part 1 talks about the inner spiritual disciplines: meditation, prayer, fasting, and study. And just as these bullet points here point out, each of these will be covered in their own Coffee, Christ, and Conversation. So next week, for example, we'll be talking about meditation. Also, it continues to move on to the spiritual disciplines that are outward: simplicity, solitude, submission, and service. The last part is part 3, corporate discipline. That is discipline done together: confession, worship, guidance, and celebration. But let's get to the meat of what we're talking about today. It's the introduction to the spiritual disciplines as a door to liberation. We're going to talk about the spiritual disciplines in general, what Richard is trying to get us to understand about what it means to seek and to practice the disciplines, and what can happen, both good and bad, within that as we pursue these disciplines. He's going to set up an understanding, too, that might change our viewpoint on sin. Most people believe it one way. He brings up an interesting point for how to consider sin in a new and different way. In this specific incident, sin as a habit. We're also going to talk about what it means to be on the path of the spiritual disciplines. What does it mean to follow the path, and where can you veer off, left or right on that? We're also going to talk about how there can be an error in imposing the disciplines on others. But rather than going over the overview, let's talk about things in specifics. So when we think about the spiritual disciplines in general, what Richard wants to make sure that we understand is that the spiritual disciplines are an inward and spiritual reality, and the inner attitude of the heart is far more crucial than the mechanics for coming into the reality of the spiritual life. I get this from page 3. What Richard is trying to lift up for us this morning about the spiritual disciplines is 2 parts. 1, they're a gift and they're a grace from God. This isn't something that you do and then it gets you a reward in and of itself. No, it's just like grace and all other things. This is something that we receive from God as we seek God and go into a deeper relationship with God. So what he's trying to point out here is that you may have heard of meditation outside of spiritual practice, even in secular circles. And that's what he's trying to push against here. It's not some psychological trick. It's not something that we do and we get a benefit from it. It's something we do to seek a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. So again, it's not just the mechanics, it's much more about how our heart changes as we seek Christ, God, and the Holy Spirit through our disciplines. I hope that makes sense. He's trying to remind us that the spiritual disciplines aren't just disciplines, they're spiritual as well. They include and focus in on God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit rather than just being something that you do. So with that, he then goes into reminding us of Colossians chapter 2, verses 21 to 22. He reminds us that Paul writes about sin, these rules have an appearance of wisdom, that is, making sure that we quash our sin through our own willpower. These rules have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value. This is from the New English Version translation. What Richard is trying to help us, and Paul through this verse in Colossians is reminding us, is if we think that we, with our own willpower, can quash sin, oh, that's fine, we can think that. But just as Paul points out here, and I've highlighted, I've bolded and underlined here, is that self-imposed worship, that is understanding that you and your own willpower can control your sinning, is not what we're after. It doesn't work that way. It's a form of idolatry. It's a form of self-imposed worship. Just because you say, well, I'm never going to do this again, and I'm never going to do that again, and I'm going to make sure that I always stay on the straight and narrow, that's not the way in which Richard is saying that we can handle the sin in our lives, those things that we do wrong over and over again. Because he also brings up the fact that what sinning is not only the one act that we do wrong, but the continual act of doing things wrong over and over and over again. He relates it to Paul when he talks about corrupted flesh. We tend to fall into habits and patterns that don't honor God. And that's why he's lifting up this understanding of sin, to remind us that there's another way than just worshiping our self-imposed worship of trying to control everything around us. Instead, it can be through a surrendering and a letting go and letting our hearts be changed and seeking God that can allow us to seek a deeper relationship with God. This is when we're talking about the path of discipleship. We must never veer off to the right, that's your left, or the left to the right or to the left, now on your right, but stay on the path. I get this from page 8. One of the things that he's cautioning against here with spiritual discipline is that the path is paradoxically simple and hard. And what he's bringing up here on the left or the right is a concept in seminary that I was taught called antinomialism, that is anti-law, and then on the other hand, works righteousness, that is making sure that you do all the right things. So when we try to walk this path of discipleship, we can veer off at times. We can think, oh, if I just do A and then B and then C, I'm fine. I'm good with God. And he's saying that that's falling off the path of what spiritual discipline is aimed at. On the other hand, because grace and God's grace and this gift of spiritual discipline is something bestowed upon all of us that we can all seek and have access to, we might fall off the other way of the path, which is to believe, none of it matters. I'll do it when I get around to it, and I don't need to worry about it in any way, shape, or form. And he wants to push against that. Spiritual discipline is a practice, but it is not the practice in and of itself. And spiritual discipline is a free gift of grace from God, but it isn't something we should take for granted. We got to make sure that we stay on the path, not veer off into just thinking, cheap grace, and not fall off into the path of you have to do right no matter what. It's in my willpower. This relates to the previous point about sin as an ingrained habit. He then reminds us and cautions us that spiritual discipline can fall into forcing it upon others. This is a quote. Deterioration of the spiritual discipline results in pride and fear. Pride takes over because we come to believe that we are the right kind of people. Fear takes over because we dread losing control. What he's trying to lift up here is that at times with the spiritual disciplines, for example, we may lust after drink. We may lust after a myriad of things in the world. Doesn't matter. I just happen to use drink for this morning. Whatever it is that you lust after, one of the ways that he's cautioning us to have our spiritual discipline is to not impose it on others. So again, using the example of drinking, he here is recommending that we don't go out and start proclaiming, "Thou must not drink, you must not drink, so that I may not drink." No, no, no. Spiritual discipline is a personal practice, and when we install it on others, as he lifts up, we're no different than the Pharisees and religious authorities of Jesus' day that he condemned for the exact same practice. When the Pharisees and they saw somebody else doing wrong, they said, "You can't do wrong because we don't want to do wrong as well." And that's a little bit of a mix-up with that. So he's cautioning us on this journey with spiritual disciplines to not impose them on other folk. And with that, one of the grace of discipleships that we can see is we can sum up this introduction in this one question, this one sentence. I hope that's what my goal is, at least. This is not in the book, this is my own thinking. But it's a question to make sure that we focus in on how the spiritual disciplines can change our lives. How do we seek God to change our hearts and surrender our will to stay on the path of personal spiritual discipline? How do you do that? How do you seek God through your spiritual disciplines? How might you surrender your will so that you don't think that, "Oh, I can stop whenever I want," and instead allow God to change you from the inside out? How can you stay on the path and not fall into, cheap grace, or the other extreme of, I have to do everything exactly right, or. How do you do that? And how do you not foist your spiritual discipline on others, but instead have it be a personal practice between you, God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit? So as we continue today, I'm hoping to help you put the pieces together. These are some questions to encourage conversation today. The first question I have for you is, what spiritual disciplines do you practice currently? What ones do you do? Do you engage in the Bible? As the book outlines, do you engage in a lot of inner, outward, or corporate ways of having spiritual discipline? What are those ways? 2, how would receiving the grace of spiritual disciplines change you? So this goes back to the first point. How would seeing that our seeking of God is a gift rather than seeking it as some kind of mechanism that can make us better, and we see it as a way instead to change our heart? This one is a poignant question. How do you battle your sin? Do you just say, "I'm never going to do it again," and try to worship your own will, as Paul points out in Colossians? Or are you seeking God's help in growing spiritual disciplines that will change you over time? Whichever way you answer the question, why do you choose that way? On your walk along the path of spiritual disciplines, when have you veered off to the right or to the left and fallen into always doing right, or falling into the understanding of cheap grace? It doesn't matter. God will forgive me anyway. I don't need to do anything. When have you done that in your own life with your spiritual disciplines? 5, why do people want to impose discipline on others? I will offer no commentary here. I am not in the mood to get in trouble today. But it is a poignant question. Why does Richard feel that he has to bring up spiritual disciplines being foisted on others as not the best way to practice spiritual discipline and spiritual discipleship? Think about that. And then our last question for today is, as we went over the introduction for inner, outward, and corporate ways of discipline, which spiritual discipline are you hopeful to receive from God through joining with me in this study this day? I'm excited particularly to learn about the outward disciplines, and I also miss the fact that I used to be able to meditate. So I'll answer this one a little bit. I'm excited for next week and all the ones moving forward. Thank you for joining me for this new format for Coffee, Christ, and Conversation. Thanks for joining me with whatever beverage you have. If you have questions, make sure you answer them down below. I hope this encouraged you to think in a new way about spiritual disciplines that Richard is trying to instill in us. And maybe, just maybe, I'm hopeful that some puzzle pieces fell into place for you this day so that you might be able to seek a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. So again, thank you so much, and have a great day.